I want to begin by introducing someone I've known for a long period of time, Dr. Yael Danieli. Dr. Danieli is a pioneer in the field of traumatology, being one of the first to develop a program for Holocaust survivors and their children. Dr. Danieli held numerous accolades. Most notably, she has served as an advisor to the Secretary General of the UN for victims of terrorism. She has truly been a force of nature and continues to be a pioneer in the field of the multi-generational impact of trauma. And so I want to welcome Dr. Danieli to the stage, and she'll be talking about the multi-generational impact of trauma on survivors and responders.
Before I begin my formal presentation, I want to share with you what I read on 9/11, both to Neil Cohen, who was at the time the Commissioner of Health and Mental Health in New York City. I mean 9/11, I mean 2001. And to Robert Dingman, who was the head of the American Red Cross Services in New York for the 3 states. And that is what led to the survivors receiving urns. And this is what I read. It was from the writings of Isabella Leitner, who was a Holocaust survivor. We lost her. But this is what she wrote on 2 occasions. She was a member of our project. Perhaps the most, what she wrote, "The sun made a desperate effort to shine on the last day of May in 1944. The sun is warm in May, it heals. But even the heavens were helpless on that day. A force so evil ruled heaven and earth that it altered the natural order of the universe, and the heart of my mother was floating in the smoke-filled sky of Auschwitz. I have tried to rub the smoke out of my vision for 40 years now, but my eyes are still burning, Mother." Later, when she had already arrived in America, she reflected, "I searched the sky in desperate sorrow, but can discern no human form. There's not a trace, no grave, nothing, absolutely nothing. My mother lived for just a while, Potio for less than 14 years. In a way, they didn't really die. They simply became smoke. How does one bury smoke? How does one place headstones to the sky? How does one bring flowers to the clouds? Mother, Potio, I'm trying to say goodbye to you. I'm trying to say goodbye." And at the time, I insisted that urns of ashes be given to every single survivor family, victims families. There's so many acronyms for what to call people after these massive tragedies, aren't they? How you classify them. And I ended up also with Bob Dingman doing a book, one of the 2 books I did on victims of terrorism. The first was an international book, and the second, with Bob, we covered all of the programs that were done in the United States. But the one thing I disagreed with Mary in Mary's presentation, I agree with everything else, is that long-term effects were not anticipated. They were. Not by the survivors and not by the politicians, the funders. But we knew. And we knew that the effects are not only long-term, but in some cases, multi-generational. And this is what I'm going to speak to you about today. And part of the challenge with even conceiving the children that would be born after the trauma, after the tragedy, would also be affected. It's very difficult. So following Isabella, I also wrote the following. The mind recoils at the horrific images that exist in the memories of traumatized people. It finds it even harder to comprehend that their yet unborn children could inherit legacies and memories that are not their own, but which nevertheless will shape their lives. So let me be more specific from now on, and a bit more formal. And in the discussion, we can just come back to being human beings with each other. But Mary was so insistent on me being just on time that I had to write it. And, and if I get a little longer, blame her. Multi-generational legacies of suffering are as old as humankind and are integral to our understanding of human history. Transmitted in word, deed, even in silence, they have been chronicled, contemplated, and examined both orally and in writing in all societies, cultures, and religions, and analyzed in multiple dimensions by scholars from many disciplines. Having included over 30 populations worldwide in my International Handbook of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma that was published in 1998, I concluded that this is a universal phenomenon. A recent literature research on the effects of violent conflicts on civilians and their yet to be born children, using intergenerational, multi-generational, transgenerational, cross-generational, or long-term as key words, yielded 500,094 and 522 records. Huh? Oh, I can't read. I'm old. If you give me a little more light, maybe. Let me try my other glasses. Nah. You grow older, you need all of these extras. Albeit a relatively recent focus in the field of traumatic stress, the transmission mechanisms explored ranged from the molecular genetic to the political. That is, They range from basic biological to complex psychological, psychodynamic constructs at the individual level, and from the intrafamilial to the extrafamilial, the sociocultural and the political. Description and explanation of transmission processes and their contents are bounded by the dimensions chosen and the theoretical orientation used. So if you're a psychoanalyst, you would speak about unconscious processes, right? If you're a behavioral theorist, you will speak from that dimension. Within the field of traumatic stress, the first and most frequent investigated offspring population is the descendants of victim survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. And I'm going to focus my presentation on our more recent study of the last 7 years that not only established for the first time the measures that to assess multigenerational legacies of trauma, the objective scientific measure, but also validated my theory of trauma and multigenerational transmission. So you will now know the hottest new findings. So I'm jumping over everybody else's work, Mary. I'm not dismissing it. As you see, it's quite serious, but I want to just share with you the now rather than how we got there. What you need to know with how we got there, for very many reasons, there have been real discrepancies in the findings in the field, from no effects to very serious effects, to a little bit here, to a little bit there. So we said, we need a theory for this, and we need to do it systematically instead of just keep arguing. While widely investigated, indeed, research on massive trauma impacts on survivors' offspring had yielded mixed findings, possibly because a valid theory encompassing multidimensional, multigenerational impacts of massive trauma did not exist. With my theory called Trauma and the Continuity of Self, a multidimensional, multidisciplinary, integrative framework, I aim to comprehensively describe the complex nature of surviving massive trauma and the diverse ways of adapting to life's challenges in its aftermath. The framework's overreaching features are its focus on self-identity, multidimensionality, the ubiquitous conspiracy of silence in the aftermath of trauma, which is a separate lecture, and continuity rupture. An individual identity involves a complex interplay of multiple spheres or systems, including but not limited to the biological, intrapsychic, familial, communal, economic, cultural, national, and international. These systems dynamically coexist along the time dimension, enabling a continuous conceptualization of life from past through present to future. Exposure to trauma causes a rupture, a state of being stuck in this free flow, which I called fixity. The time, this is the whole field of trauma in the next sentence. The time, duration, extent, and meaning of the trauma for the individual, and the survival mechanisms and strategies used to adapt to it, determine the elements and degree of rupture, fragmentation, and disorientation, that is the severity of the fixity. It can be exacerbated by post-victimization trauma exposure, such as the conspiracy of silence, that is, the survivor's reactions to societal indifference to and avoidance and denial of their Holocaust experiences, in this case 9/11, and please do try to plug in your ears, right, what you know, okay, into my presentation, although we'll need objective research for it. Now we have the tools. So, in other cases, Kyleson called it the third traumatic sequence. He speaks about before the trauma, and after the trauma. Martin Simmons called it the second wound. That is, the trauma is the first, and what comes after is the second. Extremely important stuff. Homecoming stress was called for Vietnam veterans, rape victims, etc. These are socially inflected experiences that describe dynamic interactions among the extrafamilial, intrafamilial, and intrapsychic identity dimension to explain the detrimental consequences for the survivors and offspring. So you see that, right? It's the social attitudes, you take it into the family, you take it into your own identity. Now, you don't have to. We can talk about that separately in a different seminar. Because, for example, just with Martin Simmons, I said, Martin, don't you think we'll have the third wound, that is not only what society does, the second wound to the victims, like what did you wear for a rape victim, right? But the third wound is when the survivor takes it in. Now, we don't have control over the first and the second. We do have control over the third, over what we do inside us. So, but that's a whole seminar. But just to put a seed in your mind here, talking about resilience, there is a choice. But it's so hard to exercise it. The resulting fixity may render the victim survivor vulnerable, particularly to further trauma ruptures throughout the life cycle. It may also render, you can see that, right? It's as if you scrape at the scars. It may also render immediate reactions to trauma chronic. In the extreme, survival strategies generalize to a way of life and become what I call enduring post-trauma adaptational styles. In my theory, I'm less interested in psychiatrically oriented symptomatology, but more of what the person does with it. And I view it, of course, as adaptation to trauma. We have to live with it, or we commit suicide, as Mary pointed out. These adaptational styles would thus shape the survivor's family life and in turn their children's upbringing, emotional development, identity, and belief about themselves, their peers, their societies, and the world. And the parent's fixity becomes the child's biopsychosocial milieu that ultimately influences the severity of the child, what I call reparative adaptational impact. So for the parents, you have post-trauma adaptational styles, right? In the child, it's reparative adaptational impacts. Why did I choose reparative adaptational impact? It's to express the core, perhaps unconscious motivation of the second generation to undo and repair the past and heal their parents and themselves. I have yet to find a child of a survivor who doesn't, consciously or not, devote their lives to repair. That's why I call it reparative adaptational impact. But I'll talk a little more about that. The focus on intergenerational impacts of adaptational styles augments other theories, and I would leave that be. I don't even know how much more time I have, but I think it's worth going through it. When I rehearsed it at home, I wasn't pontificating and I wasn't, I just read it straight. I forget to also put the heart into the time. Okay, I'll try to make it shorter. And we have 7 publications on this at this point. And I do have my website, so you can find them. So it's okay if I don't go into the detail in this presentation. I want to give you the flavor of where we are at. Okay, so you have the trauma, right? So you have the trauma, survival strategies, adaptational styles leading to reparative, right, impact. And you have family, along the lines of family history and family milieu and society and the time dimension. At this point, it's self-explanatory, right? I hope. Okay. The post-trauma adaptational styles. Can you read? They're really important. They're very important. We found 3 post-trauma adaptational styles with higher and lower factors. The victim style, which you see covers stuck in the loss and trauma rupture, overprotectiveness in the family, or the survivor is overprotectiveness, emotional volatility and control, right? These are in the parents, right? Then we found the numb style that's characterized by emotional isolation and detachment, intolerance to weakness. This is a little confusing to people, so I'll explain if you want. And conspiracy of silence in the family, right? These are the people who my father never uttered a word. My mother never spoke about it, right? You know this. Talking about, well, never mind. And the third is fighter style, which values mastery and justice, and valuing group identity. Now, what's important, let me also present to you the reparative adaptational impacts. You can see here that you have reparative protectiveness, which I described to you, insecurity about competence, defensive psychosocial constriction, need for power and control, obsession with the Holocaust or with any trauma in your, right? And immature dependency. I'm jumping so this is when we correlated the reparative adaptational impacts, low, moderate, high, with existing diagnostic categories, you can see that when the reparative adaptational impacts were low, the intensity was low, you had less of the diagnostic categories. When it was medium, more, and when it was high, you can see it's really dramatic, very dramatic, 46%. Now, what's important here, what's very interesting, is that what we found in terms of diagnostic categories, because I knew it will come up in the discussion anyhow, that in the children, what you find the highest is generalized anxiety disorder. So be suspicious when you read in the literature that PTSD goes sort of automatically, one-dimensionally from mother to child. Not only that, but we studied both mother and father, and both have independent effects. So not everything is in the womb. People live outside the womb too. So the second is depression. PTSD in the children it's stupid to say the word only, but it is only 14%. So please stop thinking unidimensionally. If you ever thought it's possible, let it be, let it go, because it just not work. It doesn't work. Life is quite complex. Let me share with you just another huge piece of the study that attempted to validate the theory, right? So we hypothesized that family history and family milieu, right, would lead to parents' post-trauma adaptational styles, which will lead to offspring reparative adaptational impact. Okay, I want you to see the elements of the family history, family milieu. If you can read them. Family history, for example, out of thousands of variables, actually. The ones that stood out most significantly were the parents' age cohort. How old was the parent when the trauma happened? The nature of the trauma. The family milieu after the war. There are several others. I'm just giving you highlights, more to show you the thinking than all of the findings. Those are really worth reading carefully. In the family milieu, we are talking about the sociocultural setting, and we studied both North American children of Holocaust survivors and Israeli children of survivors, right? So it was both in English and in Hebrew. Now we have 12 languages, and it's being studied all over the world, not just Holocaust, but many other populations. Only yesterday I received a dissertation from Pristina. So it's even in Albanian, with significant results. So the measure is being used really all over the world, and it's quite extraordinary to see that when you actually study, you can actually compare situations. You don't need to only speculate. You can have data. If you heard me say this 15 years ago, nobody would believe Yael Danieli is talking. But that's an in-joke. So we found significant results between Israeli and North American children of survivors. We also, the family milieu, the variable we studied also post-Holocaust socioeconomic status, post-Holocaust family size, very important, survival of mother's mother. Oh, I have a lot of time. Why did I? Survival of mother's mother, crucially important, going back to before my formal presentation, what I call broken generational linkages, very important. We should focus on that too. Continuity in religious affiliation and practices. Very interesting. The family history, the thing that was most affecting was internment and concentration camps. Again, we have tables and tables. But I want to share with you really the comparison between North America and Israel. Not so much only because it's the Jewish New Year tonight. Shana Tova to you all. And not only because I was born there and grew up there, and I'm very happy about that, always. But it raises important issues of comparison between survivors who maintain continuity of place or regain continuity of place, and those who, for example, leave, sort of hoping that if you leave, 9/11 didn't exist, or it's out there in New York, it's not where I am, etc., etc. And issues like diaspora versus homeland, particularly today with refugees being, close to 70 million. These are crucial issues for the world. So let me go into the details of that. So the majority of Holocaust survivors settled in Israel and in North America. While both sociocultural settings offered a new life, Israel symbolized millennial continuity and Jewish identity renewal. Right? North American survivors' parents showed more intense victim and fighter style than did Israeli survivor parents. Although intensity of non-style didn't differ, right? Because what you carry inside, you carry inside. It's less amenable to yes and no, you'll see in a minute. 3 of the 4 measures of identity, broken generational linkages, survival of presence of mother's mother, and intergenerational continuity in family religious affiliation practice, had stronger influence in North America. Can you picture that? That is, when identity ruptures were low, North American, like Israeli survivors, had relatively low intensities of victim style. But when identity ruptures were high, North American survivors showed relatively high intensities of victim style. These results suggest that the Israeli setting buffered, counteracted, or helped heal at least some of the adverse effects of the identity rupture suffered by survivors. Affiliation with a survivor organization showed an effect only in Israel. This is very important because you're talking about creating groups, right? Think of that. All the rap groups in America, etc., self-help groups, etc. So the group modality alone is not enough. Again, nothing, only, no one dimension does the trick. It's always complex. So let me repeat this. Affiliation with survivor organizations showed effect only in Israel. That is, affiliated Israeli parents had much less intense numb style than both unaffiliated Israeli and North American parents. So even though the numb style seemed even, in Israel, it seems just the affiliative mode of being crept into that too and helped. Thus, affiliation with survivor organization appeared helpful in reducing the intensity of numb style in Israel, but not in North America. Now, I built the first project to help Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children. We insisted that group, it's called the Group Project for Holocaust Survivors and Their Children. We saw group affiliation as a major answer. Interesting, isn't it? And not only we did, it's true of so many other populations. Overall, because the healing processes that underlie observed effects of family milieu are malleable, survivors and offspring suffering might be reduced through efforts to recapture meaning, purpose, identity, connectedness to past, present, connectedness of past, present, and future, that is undoing that stuckness, right? Recreating the flow, right? And the rootedness. And attachment to community and place. Our model provides an empirical test of whether survivors' experiences during and life circumstances after the Holocaust have measurable effects on the next generation. Now, every sentence I can create a whole lecture on, because just think about what Mary presented, right? How many challenges post 9/11 folks have gone through? The reparations, the legalism, etc., etc., etc. Of course, I can lecture about that separately, but there's such a paradox here, right? Because we know today from our work or with our people, with our population, that it is the victim style that most powerfully negatively affects the second generation. But all these long-term processes, justice, having to keep advocating for the governments and the politicians and etc., keeps you a victim, right? Because when you go to court, you appear as a victim and as a witness. So if you go to court for 20 years, that is part of what you're thinking about, that what you're being, and your children hear it. Everybody around you knows it. So these are extremely important issues. And politicians, I'll end with that, because we have a special challenge with that. So, just one message is focusing solely on clinical diagnoses as the outcomes of interest lessens our chances of comprehending the entirety and lifelong meaning of trauma survivors' offspring problems, concerns, and worldviews. I do want to end with my message to decision makers, because it's forever. I know Mary too. It's forever our painful, frustrating struggle. And I see it as it's one paragraph. Most importantly, and there are more findings, please, and I'm around, and today and tomorrow, or maybe even tomorrow, and certainly I'm reachable. I have a website you can see. But the last message I want to leave you with, our task must be to do our utmost to teach policymakers, locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally, and impress upon them that the consequences of decisions they make, often with short-term considerations in mind, can not only be lifelong, but also multi-generational, and are in stark contrast to their rhetoric of making the world a safer and better place for our generation and for generations to come. The issue is not only how many resources they choose to commit to victims' care and how they're implemented, but also the untold multidimensional costs, economic, psychological, educational, political, to name but a few, over time and down through the generations, that will be incurred if they fail to provide for victim survivors, their families, communities, and nations. Thank you. Should I leave or we have to talk?
You can leave. I just want to thank Dr. Danieli. We met very early on, and the book she referred to, she kept calling me to write a chapter.
She's
and
the only one who
I
didn't.
never got to it, but you can see we have a long-standing relationship. And I just think that her work is so incredibly important. And like the research that she's done with the Holocaust survivors, we have a large population of families, responders, and survivors that were impacted on 9/11. And we have an opportunity to take what she's learned and incorporate that, but also to take what we're learning with the 9/11 community to help other communities. And it's this is why, at the core of why we're having the event today, is to educate people that are working with victims on all levels. And so I want to thank you again, Dr. Danieli. But I did let her keep talking instead of having a Q&A, so I'm glad that she's going to be around today. So I'm going to welcome the next panel up. Can I help you? Let me carry some.